Hello and welcome to my very first ever pre-recorded Tuesday Tales of Terror. That's thunder. That's a crow. So if you've been following along at all, then you would know, or maybe not, last week I had some serious technical issues, was not able to get Facebook Live to work at all, could also not get it to work this week. Things have not been going well. And then I dropped my phone on Thursday and it is dead. It is completely dead, which sucks because I literally just got this one like a month and a half ago. So super exciting, big things. We can blame Mercury retrograde. Long story short, I think it was the universe's way of trying to tell me that they actually want me to pre-record my videos and maybe put a little bit of effort into them. We're not going to take it personally. We're just going to accept it for what it is and learn something new. The good news is that I found somewhere that I can make video clips online. It's a long story, but basically they cut you off at 30 minutes. So I can't just hog all your time. Of course, that means that if we end up going over, we're going to be cut off at 30 minutes, which could be uncomfortable. And yeah, it's been a couple weeks, so I don't even really remember what happened in the last chapters, but let's dive right in. Oh, that's right. So we've sent the young boy, Edmund, away, and Dupin is going to go talk to the two guards. And I think that he thinks that they're somehow in on the thing with the aunt and the kids and the sister missing. So that's where we are. All right, my friends, hydrate, drink some water. Tonight we have my moonshine cat cup. It says I don't have internet connection, so is it still recording? Yes. Okay, let's keep going. 6. The Providence Night Watch. Did you want words with me? Throck demanded. Dupin gestured to Edmund's empty seat. Don't mind if I do, Throck said, sitting heavily. I've had a long night. The two men looked at one another. After a while, Dupin said, It's the officer's fault. I've always said so, Throck replied, only to turn red in the face. Here, he demanded. How do you know what's in my mind? Dupin clasped his hands before him and sat back in his chair. A matter of observing details, Mr. Throck, he said. Details. You come over here and you sit down. Oh, wait, who's talking right now? Oh, that's right. Okay, let's continue. It's actually bad punctuation. See, they ended it with the quotation marks, and if you're carrying on with the same person, then you don't end with the quotation marks. Anyway, so the editor should have caught this. You come over here and you sit down, wondering why I've been fixing my attentions on you. You even study me, brow furrowed, trying to guess who I am. I follow your eyes. Your gaze passes from my face to my hand. You can make nothing of that. You notice my coat. That you recognize. You know it for an army coat. I know because the lines on your brow relax. How do you know? Why, your jacket is an army issue too, which suggests that you, like me, were once in the army. That scar on your face suggests violence in your life. The bruised knuckle suggests more, as does the pistol you've not quite concealed in your very pocket. Without thinking, Throck touched his jacket. In short, you enjoy violence to a considerable degree, Dupin continued. But why should a man like you be cashiered from the army? Here I hazard a guess. You were thrown out for excessive brawling. Ah, but if you hadn't been... See, here they did the right thing. He didn't... didn't put the second quotation mark. Ah, but if you hadn't been, you'd be in Mexico. Now, Mexico, to be sure, is a warmer place. You'd much rather be there. Whose fault is that? It's the officers' fault. I share your opinion of them. Throck studied Dupin. Who told you all that? I told you. I noticed details, and I believe, Dupin hurried on, wishing to take advantage of Throck's confusion, that we met along the docks last night, and your friend, Mr. Fourtnoy, too. Throck's eyes narrowed. Never mind who are my friends and who aren't, he said. I thought you were interested in that robbery. Should I be? Suit yourself. What I do want to know, Dupin said, leaning forward, is if any more information has been found about that unfortunate woman pulled from the bay. Throck studied Dupin carefully. Don't know what business it is of yours, he said. Course, he added, there's that boy you were just sitting here with. Same as last night. What about him? He had a mother. Caught off guard, Dupin frowned. A mother? But then, Throck added, so do we all. Or then, perhaps you don't. Dupin grew pale. Throck grinned, delighted to have discomfited the man. Is that what you wanted to ask me about? Dupin struggled to regain his composure. Last night, you mentioned an inquest. Is that today? I'd have thought you could have detailed that out, Throck said mockingly. But I'll tell you anyway, because I care flea eggs for you. It's at the courthouse, 11 this morning. And, he continued, that boy who was just here, I asked you last night, but you wouldn't answer. Oh. Is he a relation of yours? Relation? Such as his aunt was looking for? The mother? Throck winked. It takes two. Dupin felt affronted. What is all this to you? He demanded. That's my business. Dupin reached into his pocket, found the note that had been slipped under Edmund's door during the night, and pushed it across the table. Is this threat part of your business? Throck got to his feet. You can be sure of one thing, mister. And that? Once I promise to find someone, it don't matter to me if they're alive or dead. And I don't care what money there is. I know what's right. I took an oath to that. He thumped the star on his chest. You remember that, he said, shaking a massive fist before Dupin. Throck sees it through. With that, Throck snatched up the note and made his way out of the cafe, pushing people aside as he went. Run out the way. Dupin watched him go. It takes two, he murmured, then called to the waiter for more drink. As Dupin drank, he began to wonder at the similarities between the boy's life and his own. Both were abandoned boys, similar first names, both with lost fathers, for each a beautiful dead woman. In his own case, his mother, for Edmund an aunt who took the place of a mother, like himself, and dear to each someone called Sis. Yes, Dupin realized their situations were very much the same. In fact, only two details were missing for Edmund, a stepfather, a hateful one, and the death of Sis. Have I, Dupin asked himself suddenly, have I gone beyond the writing of words? Could I be writing this boy's life? But he continued, I hear you. Oh my goodness. If I'm writing Edmund's story and it is the same as mine, then it must end with the death of his Sis. The thought held Dupin fascinated him, even as it terrified him. I hear you. Go on. Hello. Yes. Hi, Cleo. Ooh. Okay, we're back. Oh, that's interesting. On Wickenden Street, 2 blocks from the cafe, Edmund had made his way through the fog to a clothing store. Once inside, he stood just by the door and looked about, all too conscious of the poor appearance he made in his tattered trousers and shirt. It was a large store with shelving which reached to the ceiling. Counters were everywhere. Not a surface was without its bolt of cloth. Edmund wished Mr. Dupin was with him. How was he to find the price of anything? In the center of the room stood a man on a platform trying on a coat. He was quite portly and had a florid face, pink lips, and great whiskers. Kneeling below him was a tailor with a mouth full of pins tacking on the bottom of the coat. Yet another man, tape measure in hand, was standing off to one side, observing the proceedings. "They say it was millions," the observer said. "All California gold." The man on the platform grunted. "I tell you, sir," the salesman continued, "there's no safety. The vault that gold was taken from had massive locks on it. Massive! And not one of them touched, so they say. The gold flew up the chimney, so to speak. There, does that look right?" The portly man turned slightly to look at himself in a full-length mirror. As he did, he noticed Edmund. For a moment he merely stared, then a flash of panic came to his face. Violently he swung away. The salesman looked around. He saw Edmund, then glanced up at his customer. Seeing the man's dismay, he rushed over to Edmund. "We're not giving anything," the salesman shouted, shoving Edmund toward the door. "Out!" "Please, sir, I only wanted to find the price of a coat." "None of that cheek," the man cried. "It's true, sir, it is." "Now don't you lie to me," the salesman insisted. "Out!" And he all but threw Edmund onto the street. Deeply humiliated, Edmund started down Wickenden, but recalled Mr. Dupin's admonition not to return too soon, his sense of humiliation increasing. He stepped into a doorway and looked back toward the clothiers. To his surprise, he saw the portly man rush out onto the street and look up and down as if in search of something. Hoofbeats heralded the coming of a horse-drawn cab. The man jumped forward and hailed it. "Church Street," he called, and began to climb inside. Just as quickly he changed his mind. Out he leaped, shouting, "Never mind," to the driver. The next moment he hurried up Wickenden Street and was lost in the fog. Edmund watched him go, wondering what had happened. Then he realized that the store was now empty of other customers. He had half a mind to go back in again, but his humiliation had been too great. He turned toward the cafe. When he arrived, Dupin was sitting at the table, writing busily. An empty whiskey bottle stood at his elbow. The night watchman was nowhere to be seen. Worried that he had returned too soon and not wishing to interrupt, Edmund slipped quietly into his seat. Dupin looked up with his cloudy eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked. His words were slightly slurred. Edmund was taken aback. "You sent me to the store, sir." "What store?" "The clothier, to find the price of a coat. Only they chased me out." Dupin continued to look at him blankly. Edmund felt even more uncomfortable. It was as if Mr. Dupin didn't know who he was. "Sir," he repeated, "you told me to go." Dupin made a dismissive gesture. "Never mind," he said. "You're to deliver this." He tore a page from his notebook, folded it over, and held it out. 88 benefit. "Is that where I delivered the note from last night?" Edmund asked. Once again Dupin's eyes glazed over with incomprehension. "Last night," Edmund tried. "You sent me there? Don't you remember?" "It was right after I ran into you," Dupin said. "I do remember." "But weren't we going to get me a coat?" Edmund asked cautiously. "Edmund," Dupin drawled, "I'm not interested in coats. Now mind, you're to put my letter." He shook it before the boy. "In the hand, only the hand, of Mrs. Helen Whitman." His voice had become even thicker. Edmund took the letter. Shall I come back when I deliver it, sir? He asked. To this very spot, Dupin said. I won't budge, not an inch, not until you return. And there's another thing, he said, leaning forward, pulling back from the stench of liquor. Edmund waited. Don't, Dupin admonished. Don't, under any circumstances, give my letter to Mrs. Whitman, unless she is completely alone. Is that clear? Edmund nodded. Now go. Disbelieving, Edmund remained seated. Go! Dupin suddenly shouted. Edmund leaped up and turned toward the door, but Dupin cried out, Edmund! Edmund stopped. I am a man who is Dupin. I shall bring this story to a satisfactory end. Now, be off. Trying to fight the pain in his chest, Edmund turned and went. As soon as Dupin saw the boy go, he got to his feet and drew on his greatcoat. Waiter! He called. Sir? Directions, Dupin demanded. Directions to the courthouse. 7. Judgment of Murder. Edmund, determined to stay on Mr. Dupin's good side so as to keep him looking for Sis, ran most of the way up Bennett Street to number 88. On the steps, he went over his instructions. Then, still breathless, he knocked on the door. A servant girl opened it. Yes, please? Please, miss. I've a letter from Mrs. Whitman. Thank you, the girl said, and reached out. Edmund drew back. I was told to give it only to her. And who gave you that particular instruction? The girl demanded. Mr. Dupin. The girl examined Edmund suspiciously. You're very dirty, she informed him. Edmund stammered. I'm only doing what I've been asked, miss. If I let you in, will you promise not to touch anything and to make no dirt? Oh, yes, miss. Of course not. The girl led Edmund into the vestibule. Stay here, she said. But before she hurried off, she gave him another warning. Don't you be making a mess now. Grateful to be out of the cold, but upset at having been spoken to in such a way, Edmund looked beyond the hall where he'd been left. The walls were covered with patterned wallpaper. The floors had carpets. Silver and books were on display. It made him feel uncomfortable to be in such a wealthy home. The servant girl returned. Come, boy, she said tartly, and brought him into a well-furnished room. There, on a chaise lounge, a woman was reclining. Her face was fair, with soft brown eyes. Masses of ringlets reached her shoulders. The splendid silk dress she wore, and which was spread about her, the small book she held in one hand, made her look like a picture. Edmund had never seen anyone so grand. Mrs. Whitman, the servant said, this is the boy who's come. Mrs. Whitman gazed at Edmund with friendly curiosity. I'm told, she said, you have a letter for me. Edmund, quite overwhelmed, merely nodded. But you've been required to place it directly into my hands. Yes, ma'am. Is it about the afternoon tea Mrs. Powers, my mother, has arranged? I don't know, ma'am. Mrs. Whitman said, May I have the letter, then? She smiled. Please, ma'am, Edmund managed. I promised to give it only when you were alone. Who gave you such romantic orders? Mr. Dupin. Who, Mrs. Whitman asked, is Mr. Dupin? Edmund didn't know how to reply. Mrs. Whitman repeated this name several times, then suddenly her face became red. Ah, she cried. Catherine, you may go. The girl gave Edmund what he took to be a frosty look, as if he'd done something wrong, then curtsied to her mistress and left. Mrs. Whitman smiled nervously. So it is Mr. Dupin who has sent you? Yes, ma'am, Edmund said, increasingly uncomfortable about the confusion his coming seemed to have caused. He wished he could leave. Where is Mr. Dupin? In Providence, ma'am. Mrs. Whitman sat up. Is he? He had me to deliver a letter to you last night. Her face paled. Last night? It was very late. Mrs. Whitman suddenly stood. Let me have your letter, she said with an air of alarm. Edmund gave it to her, wondering why she was so agitated. She started to open it, then stopped and hurried to the door. Edmund was sure she was checking to see if anyone was listening. Satisfied that no one was, she began to open the letter, but again she paused. If anyone should ask you why you've come, she warned, tell them it was Mr. Dupin who sent you. Further perplexed by this statement of the obvious, Edmund only nodded. Mrs. Whitman studied the letter for a long time. At last she looked up. Can you tell me, she asked, how Mr. Dupin is? He's fine. A line of worry creased her brow. And where is he now? In a cafe on Wickenden Street. Is he drinking? Edmund looked down at his feet. Please, it's very important. Was he drinking? A little. Mrs. Whitman sighed. Mr. Dupin is a genius, the most passionate, the most romantic of men. But, suddenly she stopped. What is your name? Edmund. Edmund what? Edmund Bremer. Is that your real name? Yes, ma'am, Edmund replied, trying to grasp the meaning of these questions. Edmund, she began. A knock on the door interrupted. Mrs. Whitman turned to him. Not a word about this to anyone, she whispered urgently. Do you understand? No one. Edmund nodded. The door opened. It was the servant girl. Yes, Catherine? Mrs. Whitman asked. Ma'am, your mother wishes to speak to you immediately. Oops. Ma'am, your mother wishes to speak to you immediately. After a moment, Mrs. Whitman said, Catherine, take this boy down to the kitchen and tell cook to get him bread and butter. Then ask my mother to join me here. She turned to Edmund. I will call for you. Edmund, feeling as if he had no choice, agreed. Besides, he was hungry. Dupin stood amidst a crowd before the courthouse, gazing at the entrance and waiting for the doors to open. Absent-mindedly, he rubbed his chin and realized he hadn't shaved. Nor did he feel particularly clean. That annoyed him. He knew he could not go to Mrs. Whitman's looking and feeling as he did. He would have to find a way to bathe. Dupin wondered and knew what had possessed him to take an interest in the boy and his predicament. Was there really a story to be written? The image of the drowned woman came into his mind. She had been, he recalled, quite beautiful. Was it, he asked himself, her beauty which made her dead? Or was it death which made her so beautiful? The courthouse doors swung open. The crowd surged forward. Trembling, Dupin went inside. In Mrs. Whitman's kitchen... we're moving on to a different section. In Mrs. Whitman's kitchen, a large black stove bloomed with heat. Edmund, sitting before it, held a slab of bread slathered in jam. Cook had her hands deep in bread dough. All that gold, the woman chatted, and all those men digging it up in far-away Californy, then bringing it to Providence, where it disappears like so much green mist. Can you imagine, lad, what a body might do with such a pile as that? No pushing bread or delivering messages for you or me. Now there's a Providence I'd give my heart and soul to. You never do know what will happen next to you. Well, a prayer for the living, I say. Edmund ate his bread greedily. Sis is alive, he prayed under his breath. She is alive. Dupin gazed over the gloomy chamber that was the court. The air was close and fetid. The walls streaked with soot, garlanded with dust-clogged webs. A few oil lamps oozed sickly yellow light over a silence, stirred just occasionally by the flutter of legal papers. That was lovely. Spectators were slumped on benches, but it was too dark for Dupin to see their features. Were they there, he mused, just to avoid the cold? Would any of them pay attention to the proceedings? 2 court officers strolled in. A fat bailiff followed, Then came Throck, bold dome of a head gleaming. He was followed by the bent, white-haired figure of Fourtnoy, who looked about nervously as though fearful he was entering a trap. "All rise!" came a cry. People shuffled to their feet. The judge, black robes draped like a Roman toga about his thick-set body, entered. Ponderously he climbed up to his high seat, then hammered his gavel twice. "State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations Court of Inquest in session," he intoned. "Inquest in the matter of unknown woman found dead in the bay," chanted a court officer. The gavel banged again. "Blah! Proceed!" Dupin tried to concentrate on the barely murmured words spoken by now this officer, now that. They didn't seem to care if anyone beyond the judge heard, and the judge, with partially lidded eyes, seemed asleep. Throck told how he was summoned by Fourtnoy, how he had examined the dead woman, how he had called for the police wagon. Did he know who the woman was? No. Fourtnoy gave his story, how he served as watchman on the ship, the Lady Liberty, how, when he relieved of his watch, he had spied the body of the deceased as he rowed to shore, how he had hauled her in. Did he know who the woman was? No! The judge dismissed Throck and Fourtnoy. They left. The talk continued, endlessly. Waves of tiredness swept over Dupin. Sorry he had come, he struggled to keep his eyes open. A doctor was called to testify, and did so while constantly pinching his nostrils with a hairy hand that muffled his words. Dupin decided he didn't want to hear them. Instead, he tried to study the spectators. One, he noticed, was leaning forward, paying particular attention. Who was it? His eyes grew heavier. He heard the doctor say, "Marks on the throat. Violence directed against the person unknown, by person or persons unknown, with malice aforethought." A groan seemed to come from one of the spectators, who, Dupin asked himself, was making that pitiable sound. Someone cares. That's important. A clue. He strove to regain full consciousness, but could not. As he sank deeper into torpor and confusion, the vision of the drowned woman looked up as if she herself was in the court, observing her own inquest, crying out for vengeance. Dupin pressed his hands to his eyes, seeking to dispel the vision. Cries of objections, cries demanding silence, a bang like the report of a pistol. A voice called out, "Judgment of willful murder of female unknown by persons unknown for reasons unknown." In the darkness which was Dupin's thought, or was it a dream, he conjured the sound of footfalls, as if the platform he had just observed was fleeing the court. Light hair trailing down like a shroud, then all became an abyss of dark. Behind Dupin, a hand slowly reached out, moved forward, and grasped his shoulder. A spasm of terror tore through him. Leaping to his feet, he whirled around. "No sleeping, sir," an aged court officer warned. Dupin looked about. The court was empty. Other than the officer, he was the only one there. He, and a sense of inescapable death. And that takes us right up to 29 minutes, which means that's the end of chapter 7. That is the end of our reading this evening. This is great. I love these little 2-chapter bites. Okay, my loves, we're going to wrap it up shortly because we only have about a minute and a half left. So I hope that you have a magical week and that something wonderful happens to you. I love you. Peace, love, and stay spooky. Mwah. Ciao. Ciao.